This is another episode of A to the Show, guys. Thank you for coming back on and watching. Today we have a very interesting guest. We have Dr. Wakefield. You are someone that has many titles, many roles. You've been an ex-physician. You have been part of you are one of the starters of the anti-vax movement. People have called you a hero. And then there's the other side that has called you a fraudster or a liar. And maybe we can start off with what would you call yourself? That's that would be a good start.
What am I? Well, I was a physician. I still think as a physician. I still try and conduct myself as a physician. And my job was to listen to parents' stories, to put the patient first above all other considerations. And I would, I'm seeking the truth through the scientific method. I'm trying to find out whether the
Uh,
parent's story, in this case, specifically the regression of their child into autism following exposure to a vaccine, has merit, whether it's true, and whether we can put that to the test. But it is true until proven otherwise. That's the point that the position that
mhm,
medicine should take, and I've taken, that it has merit until proven otherwise. And it's up to me and others like me. We have a moral and professional obligation to answer their questions and
hmm
not walk away from them because it's politically or commercially uncomfortable.
You
mhm.
know,
And yeah,
I'll
go ahead,
follow
Adam.
up on that. Yeah, we used to trust the institutions a bit more. My mom's a pharmacist, and growing up, I never thought about, pharmacy or the drug pharmaceutical industries as being maybe more corrupt. But doing a bunch of the research for this podcast, we've come across a lot of things that show us that, well, first of all, vaccine companies, you can't sue them, right? They haven't been able to be criticized for decades, and they're not transparent at all. We don't know at all any of the injuries coming out of vaccines. We've interviewed someone on this podcast who, after taking the COVID vaccine, started having a lot of negative symptoms. He lost his ability to walk, so many negative side effects, and I feel like all that information is not transparent at all when taking vaccines. So my question is, if we right now had full transparency, what would we find out about vaccine injury?
I think full transparency would come from, for example, a comparison of the health outcomes, long term health outcomes in, say, children receiving all of the childhood schedule
Mm,
of vaccines compared with those receiving none. That would be a so-called vax-unvax comparison. That's the gold standard. That's the standard by which pharmaceutical drugs are held, the standard to which they're held, and are the standard that's demanded by the Food and Drug Administration, but not for vaccines. And at the flip side of that is that, as you point out, they have no liability.
hmm
So they have a perfect business model. They have a mandatory market. These children have to get their vaccines to attend public school, for example. There are very few exemptions, and those are being taken away. So you have a mandatory market and no liability. You have a perfect business model. All you can do is make a massive profit, and making a massive profit makes you very powerful.
hmm
And you exercise that power by influencing politicians, by influencing the media, by advertising your drugs on television, and suddenly you take control of a huge empire that over
Yeah.
which the consumer has very little say, and most certainly, as you point out, is not getting the truth.
Okay. So what is the truth then? So because we looked at your study in the Lancet paper that was retracted, and then we've also looked at all of your documentaries that have mentioned the association of the vaccine with regressive autism. But at the same time, something that I noticed in the paper was the mentioning of the striking association with autism and the vaccine, but with the conclusion saying that it was not, it wasn't discovered that there was an association. So what exactly is the truth there? Where is there an association between the vaccine and autism, or is there not?
Yeah, let me try and answer that question for you. That the paper that we published was a case series. You can't come to conclusions about causation. All you can do
Hmm.
is take, in this case, 12 children with a consistent pattern of signs and symptoms,
Yeah,
and you report the parents' story. This is what the parents told us. This is what we
yeah,
found on physical examination. And this is what we found when we did special investigations, like, for example, colonoscopy or looking at their
mm,
bowel biopsies under the microscope. And in doing that, you can say, this is fascinating. There's something new here. This needs
yeah,
further investigation. What you cannot do is claim that it proves in any way an association, let alone a causal association. So it was a very sober conclusion to that paper. And what that
yeah.
leads to now is what we call hypothesis testing studies that say, well, okay, is this, do we see this in children who didn't get the vaccine? Do we see the same pattern of disease? Is there a difference between these two? Is the bowel disease novel, or is it something we've seen before, like, say, Crohn's disease or food allergy? And
Hmm.
that's the sort of the iterative nature of science. And that's the path that we were on. And when I left the Royal Free, I think we'd published something like 15 papers on this process, going through the scientific method to ask those questions. The
Yeah,
interesting thing, and you say, where did the science come, where did it lead to? I was invited to speak to members of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, in the early years of 2000s. And they said to me, Dr. Wakefield, look, all children get MMR vaccine, only some get autism. How do you explain that? I said, well, that's medicine, okay? A lot of people smoke, only some people develop lung cancer. What are the
yeah,
cofactors that influence risk? We don't know, but there clearly are cofactors. I believe that age of exposure is important. The younger you get the vaccine, the greater the risk. Now, why? Why would I put forward that idea? Because measles, for example, when you get it under one, can be much more serious than if you get it later in life. And so there was
okay,
a natural model for why that hypothesis should be tested. Anyway, so the CDC said, okay, and they went away and they tested that hypothesis and they found it to be exactly true. The
hmm,
younger you got the MMR vaccine, the significantly greater the risk of developing autism. What did they do with that information? They buried it. They destroyed the documents, they covered it up, they lied to the public, and they published something completely different, exonerating the vaccine. How do we know this? Because one of the senior authors of that study from the CDC came forward 14 years later and said, I can no longer live with this. I kept all the documents. We committed fraud. Here is the truth. And so it's not my opinion or my producer's opinion. It's it's there. It's factual evidence presented by the CDC themselves. And that was the basis of the film Vaxxed, which you may well have seen.
yeah,
And so at that point, the need to destroy those documents to cover up that information, that persuaded me more than anything else that this causal association with MMR was real. And it's been buried. And millions of children have been put at risk of a serious permanent neurological disease in order to protect the vaccine program and the vaccine policy makers. Not to protect the children, but to protect those making the decisions about vaccines and those profiting from vaccines. So it's a very vexed situation. Like you say, it's extremely polarized. People have very different opinions. Unfortunately, now we have Bobby Kennedy Jr. in the White House as head of Health and Human Services, who will, I trust, get to the bottom of this. That's what he's vowed to do. And let's hope that he can do that.
All right.
it's interesting that you mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr. because we were looking at, I think it was either yesterday or before yesterday, when he fired all of the 17 representatives of the uh, vaccine council. Um, Me and Ali were discussing this point because when you do that, based on obviously the history that you were mentioning, yes, that's logically a good decision to remove the people who made the mistakes. But at the same time, if you're going to bring a new council, completely new representatives that all support your opinion, isn't there a bit of a confirmation bias there?
There is that danger. You're quite right. The reason that he got rid of them is that everybody on that committee is funded by the pharmaceutical industry,
Hmm.
by the vaccine
Mm,
manufacturers. And you can't
okay.
have an unbiased opinion when you're receiving funding from the people you're meant to be regulating.
Right.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
how that was allowed to happen is astonishing, but it did happen, and there we are. And I think he's trying to clean house and bring in new people. What he needs to do, and I think what he will do, is bring in people who are objective, who don't agree with him, who,
Okay.
a mixture of people who can give valid, if conflicting, opinions on whether a vaccine is merited or not. So let's see what he does. But it really comes down to, as you point out, the selection of the individuals to avoid that kind of confirmation bias. And I think he's wise enough not to fall into that trap.
Okay. Would you take the role if you were offered?
Sorry, no, I wouldn't. I am, I am a filmmaker now, and I have a particular bias, and I would exclude myself on the basis of that bias.
Fair
Fair enough.
enough. We watched your documentary about the tetanus vaccine in Africa and how people became infertile after taking that vaccine. So, just a question about vaccines in general. Which vaccines are safe? Which vaccines are not safe? Right now, if we had a kid, how would you advise people to take? What ages? What vaccines to take? What do you think about this?
Well, it's a very good question.
Hmm.
Firstly, the gold standard, as I mentioned, is a comparison. Before you license a vaccine, they should go through a proper trial, a large randomized placebo-controlled trial to look at the long-term safety and efficacy of that vaccine. That has never happened for any of the vaccines on the recommended childhood schedule, at least up
Okay.
until the COVID shot, which is
Hmm.
a minor exception. But that has not happened. And therefore, you cannot determine that a vaccine is safe. You can't do it because you don't have the information. It's all very well if your belief system is that it's safe and effective. And we hear this time and again from the authorities, safe and effective, but the data are not there to support it because the studies have not been done. And so no vaccine at the moment on the childhood schedule can be considered proven safe. It isn't. What would I do? And I don't give vaccine advice to parents. I don't tell them to vaccinate or not. My job is to educate people, to take information and turn it into films, to do the heavy lifting for them,
Hmm.
to assimilate the science in a coherent and hopefully entertaining way that allows them to then make a decision, to go down that rabbit hole, to investigate, to research themselves, so that they can come to a fully informed opinion. What would I do if I had a child today, if I had a newborn?
Hmm.
I wouldn't vaccinate them. I wouldn't do it because
Mm.
the safety of those vaccines has not been proven to me sufficiently.
So when you say that, do you mean you wouldn't vaccinate at all, any vaccine whatsoever? Because in the past you have said um, instead of using the MMR vaccine, it would be better to split it and taking it like with 1 year apart as being the safe choice. Because obviously children can still be infected by measles and um, another and rheumatoid, but and we've seen obviously recently like two children have died from measles. So why the change of opinion now? Why would
Okay,
you not vaccinate?
you're absolutely right. Back in 1998, when the paper came out, that was my suggestion to parents.
Hmm.
I knew very little about other vaccines. I wasn't a vaccine doctor, I was a gastrointestinal surgeon. And so,
Hmm.
based upon the stories that parents were telling us, and because we saw this almost exclusively in children receiving MMR, not the single vaccines, the single measles vaccine, I made that recommendation. I then came to America to testify before Congress, and I heard about the mercury preservative in vaccines. I thought that's crazy. No one would surely inject any child with mercury, but lo and behold, mercury was in the vaccine, many of the vaccines, ostensibly as a preservative, and mercury is incredibly toxic, particularly to the
Yeah.
developing brain. So why were they doing that? Then I discovered there was aluminum in them. And so as I learned more and more and more, my position changed. It
Hmm.
was reinforced in the setting of MMR by the CDC fraud, but it also embraced other vaccines as well until I came to the realization that Bobby Kennedy's come to, that Peter McCullough, that all these people have come to, that there is no such thing as a safe vaccine. So my opinion has certainly changed over the years to become more polarized, if you like,
Yeah.
in the demand for adequate safety profiling studies of these vaccines. That has not happened. So that was the basis for the change in my thinking about this.
Yeah.
And it will continue to evolve as the science emerges.
So in conclusion, it comes down to the parent to decide whether they want to take the risk with the vaccine or take the risk with natural causes.
Absolutely. It must, in the end, be based upon fully informed voluntary consent. That is the basis
Hmm.
of medicine. One of the founding principles of medicine is that you cannot force a medical procedure on anyone. You can't bully them or coerce them. But clearly, we've seen that happen
Mm-hmm.
time and time again with vaccines, and in particular the COVID shot,
Mm-hmm.
which is reprehensible. It's unforgivable. And people suffer as a consequence, but have no comeback. When they're injured, like the guy you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about, he's left to fend for himself because there's no liability for the damage done by these vaccines.
That's
He
true.
tried to like group up with a bunch of other people, looking for people that had side effects to the COVID vaccine. Like he lost his ability to walk, so it was very bad for him. And he found a bunch of other people that had negative um, effects from the vaccine. But then when he tried to like do something about it, he couldn't get far. No one was going to listen to him, and no one was being held accountable. And so he gave up on that project. It's so like hopeless. It feels like. Hopefully, Bobby Kennedy, you know, now that he's in charge, is able to switch things up. What are you hoping that? Sorry, RFK. What are you hoping that RFK is able to um, do now that he's in charge? Like, what by the end of his term? What do you think is the possible outcome?
I think if he only achieved getting a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study done, that would be huge. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
database is available or should be
Mm-hmm.
available. It's called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's
Right.
held by Kaiser over there in California,
Mm-hmm.
and it was set up specifically to help with this kind of study. It should have been publicly available as a database for scientists to answer this question many years ago, but it has been kept from the public. It's been kept from independent researchers by the CDC. They've been prevented from getting access. And now that's going to change. So I think if he achieves that and answers the question, are vaccines causally associated with these problems, then that's a huge step forward.
Mhm.
Said.
Yeah. So I wanted to go to I had kind of two questions in mind, but they're related to each other and possibly follow each other. The first one was you mentioned that your original background is in gastronomic. I sorry, I didn't remember the exact name of it, and I couldn't find it.
Gastroenterology.
There you go. So that's your main background. What led you to the field of autism? What brought you to working with um, parents that I know obviously you've met with parents that have children with autism, and maybe that's how you first got connected. But with a person who doesn't have that background, what got you into that field? And then my second question would be, what is autism for you? What do you know about autism?
Gosh, well, how did I get into it? It's a fascinating story, and it really again comes back to that sort of fundamental rule of clinical medicine that you listen to the patient, or in this case, the patient's parents, specifically the mother in many cases. And
Mm,
I think it was in May 1995, I had published a paper in the Lancet linking Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, to the single measles vaccine and to odd patterns of measles exposure, like exposure in the womb, this kind of thing. And I started getting calls. I got a call from a mother, very articulate, highly intelligent, who said my child was perfectly fine. He then
mm,
got an MMR vaccine. He had speech and language interaction with his brother and sister, and then all of that disappeared in a very short time, a very short space of time after the vaccine. And he's now been diagnosed with severe autism. And I said, I'm sorry, I know absolutely nothing about autism. When I was at medical school, graduated in 81, we weren't even taught about it. It was so rare. 1 in 20,000 children, I think it was at the time, 1 in 10 to 20,000. I said, you must have come through to the wrong number. And she said, no, the reason I'm calling you is that my child has terrible gastrointestinal problems, bloating, diarrhea, alternating constipation and diarrhea, failure to thrive, all of the cardinal features of an underlying disorder, an underlying disease. And yet the
mhm,
doctors and nurses have said, oh, that's just part of autism, forget about it, put them in a home and have another child, forget about them. And I was astonished by this. And I heard this story time and time again. So I put together a team to investigate the gut in these children, the gastrointestinal tract. And lo and behold, the parents were right. The children had inflammation. And when we treated the inflammation, not only did the bowel symptoms get better, but the
mm,
autism got better. And that was astonishing. And it wasn't just that it was a child who was no longer in pain, therefore he was able to pay attention. They started using words that they hadn't used for 5 years. It was
mhm.
extraordinary, and we didn't believe it. And so we did it
Yeah.
again. We did it 183 times, and it happened each time. So
Wow.
we then were persuaded there was something really very, very interesting here, and particularly in terms of the link between what was going on in the intestine and the brain. What was that link? And we were in the process of trying to answer that question when my research program was sabotaged and
Oof.
the work never got done. So we'd have many more answers for you now if what is autism, if we'd been allowed to continue that work. The classical teaching of autism at the time, I would go to the Institute of Child Psychiatry and talk to them about our findings. And these were all very eminent child psychiatrists, psychologists. And they would say, my dear boy, here's what we know about autism is that you're born with it, that children don't regress. Parents just think they were speaking, but they were just making noises. There is no bowel disease in children with autism. It's
Mhm,
not reversible. There's nothing you can do about it. Once it's there, it's fixed. And diets, for example, gluten-free diets, make no difference whatsoever.
What?
Every single word of that was false,
Yeah.
completely
mhm,
false. And the parents' stories and everything that we found prove that. And that's now been subsequently confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
So the bowel disease has been confirmed.
Yeah.
The regression's been confirmed. And it was so demeaning to the parents to dismiss their story out of hand when what they were giving us is vital clues as to the origin of this problem. But that was the mainstream teaching, and they held firmly and religiously to that belief, to their graves, to their graves. It's astonishing. And yet they were not believing what they were seeing in front of their very eyes. And so I came to, I suppose, I came to part ways with mainstream medicine when I realized how flawed that ingrained thinking was, and invested much more of my belief in listening to the parents and acting on their stories to determine whether they were right or wrong. And that really changed my whole view of what autism is. So it's not a psychological disorder. It's not a genetic disorder, although genetics may influence the risk. It's something environmental that's triggering what's called an encephalopathy, or an inflammation of the brain, and encephalitis. And it is reversible, and that's very, to an extent. I don't think it'll be cured, but we can certainly reverse many of the features. And so to deny that is to deny children the potential benefits of proper therapy. So my views have really been focused around the learning experience, excuse me, from interacting with parents.
So, from my understanding, it sounds like if children with autism or individuals with autism in general were given like a certain strict regime, or like some sort of structure, including like a structure on their diet, on their lifestyle, this can, and obviously maybe some communication techniques and social interaction techniques that can be taught to them, they can learn how to avoid these developmental issues that have been mentioned. Um, is that accurate to say?
Well, I think there's some even more fundamental. This is really interesting, and your BCBA colleague there will find this, and you may know about this already. But what's fascinating is, years ago, I'd been told one thing about autism by the experts. I then went to California, and I was with a friend who had a severely affected nonverbal son. And it was the very beginning of my experience with autism. I knew very little. And he said to his son, who was about 13 at the time, "Would you like to go to Chuck E. Cheese?" His son was nonverbal. He couldn't give him a verbal response. But he was walking past the swimming pool, and when he had that question put to him, he stopped. You know, like people have to kind of stop and think about something. You could see him thinking. You could tell he was thinking. And he had understood the question, but he had no way of providing an answer. Conventionally, he couldn't speak. So after a while, he went over, he took his father's arm, led him to the garage, to the car, and that was his way of saying, yes, let's go to Chuck E. Cheese. So he had not only understood the question and knew what his response was to be, he found a way around the inability to speak, to communicate that, by taking his father. It was highly intelligent. And then I found another child in California as well, who, of a similar age, nonverbal, wrote the most exquisite poetry. Couldn't speak, but wrote the most exquisite poetry. And he did it on a letterboard, pointing to letters.
Yeah.
And when this was shown to an autism expert, he said, this is all fake. It's all been a scam. It's just snake oil. It's his therapist who's guiding his arm. I looked at the therapist and interviewed her. I looked at him. This poetry was so idiosyncratic, so unusual, that there's no way she was writing it. Absolutely no way. It was coming from his mind. Now, since then, and so I realized that there is much more to these children, these adults, than had previously been, oh, they're mentally retarded. No, no, absolutely not. We are mentally retarded. We have failed to understand how we need to communicate with them. Now, what's happened
Yeah.
since
That's right.
is people, again, in California and elsewhere, have shown through, if you ever get a chance to watch Spellers, the documentary Spellers,
Okay.
how individuals, nonverbal individuals with autism, actually are highly, highly intelligent, highly gifted, but they don't
Mm.
have the ability to communicate as we communicate now. And so they've learned now to do it on the letterboard. They start on the letterboard, they move to the keyboard, now they type. And what you realize is they can speak 5 languages. They can do remarkable things. They have remarkable gifts, but those gifts, and it's completely changed the perception of many, many people of what autism is,
Right.
what is actually going on. And it's not they who need to learn, it's us. We need
Hmm.
to learn from them how to communicate with them in unconventional ways. And that's now is what's happening. So if people listening to your show get a chance to watch Spellers, an extraordinary revelation and well worth it.
I'll definitely check it out. Yeah, it's so true how autism, I don't see autism as like a negative thing per se. I mean, autism is such a variety. There's all kinds of people who have autism, and in some ways, it is people do have gifts, that are on the spectrum. So, um, it's uh, it's amazing that we're able through teaching them different communication styles, how they like helping them thrive a bit more in their environment. And yes, like you say, like we're the ones that are mentally retarded. Like we're the crazy society that is making it worse for them. And I think the environment has a huge part of that too, right? If we're able to design environments that stress-free environments where they have support and resources, um, I mean, I think that's how you end up with a show like Love on the Spectrum, right? Where these people have autism and communication disorders, yet they're able to find love, which is amazing. Have you had the chance to see that show?
No, I haven't. I will. I will make a note of it. Thank you.
Love on the Spectrum. Sang, you've seen
Love
it, right?
on the spectrum. Right. Writing it down now.
Incredible. Yeah, just so cool to see people that have autism just fall in love, which is something that you would never, it's hard to imagine for a lot of people, but it's possible, right? With proper support. I want to know more about the gut, autism, diet, relationship. I know in your film Protocol 7, that like they were trying so hard, so many different kinds of diets and sticking to strict diets, and it has to be completely gluten free. Or what is the relationship then? And we know about inflammation in the brain having to do with autism, and especially like severe tantrums and aggression and self-injury behavior. We know that's tied to inflammation in the brain, and the brain's tied to the gut. So, and then why do people with autism also just like eating chicken nuggets and pizza or fries? Just like all the time. Um, yeah, what is the link between all that, and what's the right diet you would recommend for parents?
Right. Well, the way I came to this, and there are so many unanswered questions, but the way I came to this is that when I first became involved in autism, there was a theory at the time that certain elements in the diet, particularly gluten
Mm,
and casein from dairy products,
mm,
were metabolized in the gut into opioids. They're turned into opioid peptides, morphine-like compounds, and then in a healthy gut, they're further degraded, and they don't cause any problem other than maybe making you sleepy after a meal. But in people with autism whose gut is not working properly, do these opioids get through and affect the developing brain. Now, morphine-like peptides can influence the development of neuronal synapses, for example. This was all theory at the time, and it remains theory. So that the one possibility they were putting forward was that it was a toxicity, that food was toxic because the bowel was not processing it properly. At the same time, there were a group of people in California, UC Davis and elsewhere, who suggested that it was allergy to those foods, that the foods were causing an allergic reaction in the intestine and in the brain of children with autism. That was then triggering this gut-brain connection. Now, both ideas are not mutually exclusive. You could have a toxic and an allergic component to it. And the removal of these elements from the diet prevented that. And there's no doubt that we saw dramatic effects from removal. Well, if you took a child and you, first of all, they were profoundly affected, they weren't on a special diet, they weren't sleeping at night, and you put them on a casein-free diet, you took cow's milk products out of their diet, they started sleeping.
Wow.
It was remarkable. Parents would say, he hasn't slept like this in an age. And if we have a dietary infraction, he gets some milk, then we see a rapid deterioration in his behavior for a period of weeks. So the story was so consistent, the clinical story. Did we know what the mechanism was? No. And again, my research was involved in looking at what that mechanism might be, or mechanisms, but we never got to answer that question. So, but the chief medical officer, like the Surgeon General in America, in England, said to me, I just don't get this link between the gut and the brain. I just don't understand it, as though they were two separate entities attached to different parts of the. And I said, well, look, let's go for a beer, and I will show you. He thought I was offering to buy him a pint of beer. I wasn't offering at all. Couldn't stand the man. What I was saying is, if you drink a pint of beer, then within a few minutes, you'll feel the effect in your brain.
Totally.
Gut-brain connection. The way we treat psychological or diseases like depression, for example, are with oral medication. They get through the gut and have an effect on the brain. This is not rocket science. This is very straightforward.
Or sugar.
Is it not possible that something that we're eating is influencing our behavior? Yes, absolutely. And if that substance that we're eating is toxic to the extent that it injures the developing brain, could it possibly have long-lasting effects? Absolutely. So is it plausible? Is it biologically plausible? Yes. Did we have the evidence for it at the time? No. And sadly, we still don't.
Well, yeah, I wish there were a lot more research on all this, and I wish they didn't stop your research. I mean, what's the harm of doing research? You either find a conclusion or you don't find it, and then you move on to the next study. I don't see any harm in doing research.
The harm is if it affects your profitability in the case of...
Have there ever been societies that are like removed and don't have vaccines at all? Do they still have autism? I don't know if you know about this.
I think the Amish are an interesting example of a population. They don't vaccinate. They have the few cases of autism that are in the Amish community, and this was investigated years ago by the late Dan Olmsted. He found that they were adopted children, some of them Chinese, who had been adopted by the Amish and had been vaccinated. So, and to your point, Saeed raised an issue of measles in America, 2 children dying of that. The scrutiny of the medical records of those children, which have been provided to experts, show that they didn't actually die from measles. They died because they had a secondary pneumonia and they were put on the wrong antibiotics, or the antibiotic,
Wow.
the right antibiotic was delayed. It was delayed overnight. And so there is a body of opinion that believes this was an issue of medical misconduct rather than being death from measles. And that's been reported to the media, but they don't want to report that in turn. So, yeah, independent scrutiny of the medical records of those children suggests something different.
Where can we find this? Like, on which news source would you recommend to find this information?
The best place to go to is Children's Health Defense, CHD TV. If you go to CHD TV, you'll see the interviews with the doctors who analyze those records.
All right. Yeah,
Wow.
found it.
What do you think about that site?
I'm just gonna share the website just so that people can see.
Yeah.
So this is the one that you were talking about. Defender News.
Yeah, you'll have to look in there. It'll be under vaccine
There we go.
in West Texas.
Okay.
Somewhere in
We'll
there,
look at that.
you'll find a series of interviews. Yeah.
Okay. We can look at
What does
that
that make you think, Saeed?
after the show.
Yeah.
Sure.
Something that popped into my head when we were discussing this concept of profitability and vaccines was this might also be a sensitive topic for you, but I did want to bring it up and ask you about the independent research that you were funded to do. I think this was in the early 2000s was it by Richard Barr on single-use vaccines. Can you tell us a bit more about that case, that situation, what exactly was going there? Because from an outside perspective, it can come off as a bit of maybe a wrong decision on your side to take on this funding by someone who might have an agenda behind this data and this research. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to make a decision here. Obviously, I'm not saying that what you did was right or wrong, but I'd like to know more information.
Yeah, absolutely. So after I'd started the work and it became widely known that we were investigating autism and MMR vaccine, I was approached by lawyers, and they were contemplating a class action against the manufacturers in the UK for autism cases. They said, what would you do if you wanted to investigate the role of vaccine? What would your next step be? And I said, I would look for evidence of the virus in the diseased intestinal tissues. I'd look for measles in there. And they said, will you do that? And I said, well, we can design a study that will do that, yes. And so they funded a study. They didn't fund me personally. They funded a study to investigate whether or not there was evidence of the virus in these tissues. So the study was properly designed with controls. It wasn't, just my speculation. It was a properly designed study. And the later allegation was that the Lancet paper had been funded by these lawyers, by the Legal Aid Board, which is a government entity that provides funds to, for example, children who can't afford to litigate on their own behalf. And the allegation was that the Lancet paper was funded by them. No, it wasn't. It absolutely was not. It was a study of children coming to the hospital under the National Health Service. It received no funding whatsoever from any lawyers or any legal aid board. But that was the allegation. And that was what was reported in the media. And made it absolutely clear that that wasn't the case. Moreover, I informed the editor of the Lancet, Richard Horton, over a year in advance of the paper being published, that I was acting on behalf of these children in litigation. Now, this happens all the time in medicine. You have doctors are asked to act on behalf of the plaintiffs or the defendants, and they do so. That's part of our obligation. And that is what I did. But that had no impact upon the Lancet study whatsoever. But that was the allegation that was made. So I was completely open. I not only told the Lancet, I published it in a national newspaper, in the independent newspaper, and also told everyone in the sort of line management at my medical school, the dean downwards, that I was doing this work on behalf of these children. So there was no secret whatsoever, but that's the way it was portrayed.
Okay. And why the patent? And this is a vaccine that would be used by millions of people that could help save so many lives. Why patent it? What's the point of that?
Yes, again, the allegation was that I had filed a patent for a competing vaccine against MMR, and I was trying to put the MMR out of the market and clean up, take over the market. Well, the patent was for a natural dietary supplement. It's the first milk that a mother produces, called colostrum, when she's lactating. And
Yeah.
it has immune properties. And so what we were doing is suggesting that this colostrum might help in healing children and might protect against measles. It wasn't a patent, it wasn't a vaccine in any shape, manner, or form that could compete with MMR. Firstly, we were interested in children who could not receive live viral vaccines. So if you have an immunodeficiency, if your immune system is not working well as a child, that is a contraindication to receiving a live viral vaccine like MMR.
Right.
And what we were saying is there needs to be an alternative, and maybe this is it. So we're not looking to compete with MMR. We're looking to provide an alternative way of protecting children who cannot have MMR. And that was, immunodeficiency was described in detail in the patent. But again, I was accused of trying to put MMR out of the market and clean up with my own patent. That was clearly nonsensical. There was no mass market for what we were doing. It was for a specific group of children who could not receive live viral vaccines. So there we are. It's part of history now, and the media will report what the media are going to report. But I'm very grateful to you guys for at least giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
No, of course. I mean, we're happy here on the podcast to always learn both sides. We most of on most things, we like to not take a side. We like to hear the events and use the facts to kind of classify what actually is happening and what isn't. Because I think the main issue these days is when it comes to like obviously like when there's two groups arguing against each other and they're fighting against each other on whatever topic it is, they don't just take a second to listen to the information from or the discussion point from both sides and then come to a conclusion. They just like to jump to a conclusion on one single point that sounds like the most logical to them. Sometimes it can be done through maybe one charismatic individual, maybe it's like through marketing, propaganda, whatever technique or style is conducted. Um, we when we look at it, this doesn't sound always right, you know. So we don't like to jump to conclusions, is what I'm trying to say.
Very wise. Very wise.
Thank you.
I want
Adi.
to know a bit more about your transition into filmmaking. Why did you leave researching to move into making documentaries and now into making fiction films?
Right. I came to America as a political and professional exile. I did continue the research here, but they eventually shut that down because it was, challenging the status quo. over the years, people had come to me from various federal agencies and drug companies with stories of fraud. They said, "We've done a terrible thing. Here is the evidence." And I eventually thought, you know what, these would make wonderful films. And I'd been screenwriting since 2004. And I thought, you know what, these are the stories that need telling. They're rather like Erin Brockovich or
Mm-hmm.
The Insider or this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They were wonderful stories of brave people coming forward and taking huge risks to expose fraud in the industry. And so that's what I
Mm.
did. And that was the basis of my films so far, including the latest fictional, or based on a true story, but narrative feature film, Protocol 7. And that did very well. We won 34 film awards, and which is dangerously close to being respectable for me. But that's what I'll continue to do. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a number of major films in this field left to tell. And so, if anybody out there wants to help make those films, always glad to hear from you.
Do you not worry that maybe um, doing the same style or the same type of documentaries might affect or derail your career in movie making?
Yeah, I've kind of moved on from documentary. I enjoyed documentary filmmaking, but
Mm-hmm.
now I want to make feature films because they,
Yeah, maybe the theme that I'm referring to is like the vaccine concept.
sure. The next film, in fact, the proposed isn't a vaccine story at all.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
about
Oh, nice.
it's about autism, but it's
Mm.
autism set in it's a western set back in 1850.
Oh, wow.
Even though
Okay.
autism probably didn't exist in its same form then, that doesn't matter. That's poetic license. And it's about it's the core theme of the story is that the shared fear of all families with affected children or adults, their most pervasive fear is what happens to my child when I die or I become infirm and can no longer look after them. They will fall upon the mercy of a world that doesn't really understand them, doesn't care, doesn't love them,
Mm,
and I won't be there to protect them. And so it's a story that really takes that theme and takes the extraordinary lengths that a mother will go to in this case to protect her child against adversity. And so that's what, and it's something that people don't appreciate. And the reason for making this film is that autism is now so common.
Mm-hmm.
In one in 20 children, one in 20 boys in
Wow.
California.
Mm-hmm.
It is so common globally
yeah.
that we are going to be faced with this very same problem. What do we do? How do we provide for all of these individuals, particularly when their parents are gone and no longer there to look after them? And that is a major issue, and it's one that this film embraces. So that's the story I want to tell.
And you mentioned that autism is very prevalent, and 1 in 20 boys have it. Um, have you ever yourself maybe got tested or just to find out more about information about yourself? Have you ever considered taking a look, or have you tested yourself
Have I
for autism? Sorry, like is
have I tested myself?
yeah, just out of curiosity,
No,
wondering.
not even out of curiosity. I'm sure there are many people around me who would tell me if they thought if I was odd in any way, let alone autistic. But no, I haven't. I've never been asked that. It's a very interesting question. Maybe I should take a look in the mirror before criticizing other people. I think.
The question, to be honest, it stems from actually a personal experience because so Ali mentioned he's an ACBA therapist and he works with autistic children, and we've known each other for 15 years. Um, and he never once suspected that I might have it. We've talked to a few experts on the podcast, and I'm in the process of getting a formal diagnosis. I've also done my own research, specifically on Asperger's syndrome. And whenever I have a conversation or learn about this topic, um, I felt like I could relate a lot to it, especially to some of the symptoms. Um, I am already confirmed that I am definitely neurodivergent because I have been diagnosed with ADHD.
Right.
So there's a possibility that I have a combination of those. But yeah, the reason why I'm asking this is, for example, Ali, who is an expert in this, works with a lot of people in this field, didn't notice. So, and I didn't notice until it was the information was like kind of brought to me.
Well, you raise a very, very interesting issue, and that is that you talked about the spectrum of disorder, and
Mm-hmm.
there clearly is
Yeah.
that. And we see that medicine presents us with the worst cases first. So we
Mm-hmm.
see the most extreme cases of autism and recognize it and define it according to those what we
Yeah.
see, the parameters. What we then realize is nature doesn't work like that. Disease doesn't work like that. It
Hmm.
works as a continuum.
Yeah.
And we've been looking at this end of the continuum, but there are many, many people who have lesser degrees of problem, right down to ADD, ADHD, all these things. And so
Yeah.
the problem may be far more pervasive than we recognize. And that isn't without that. If that were true, that wouldn't be without consequence.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a very interesting point.